Take a Social Security benefit of $3,000 a month at full retirement age. File at 62, and the deposit that hits the account is $2,100. Wait until 70, and the same benefit pays $3,720. Nobody changed the formula. Nobody changed the earnings record. The only variable that moved was a single decision made once, usually inside a 15-minute phone call, and it's worth $1,620 a month, every month, for the rest of a life. $19,440 a year. Run it over 20 years, and the gap is $388,800. Not projected, not hoped for, just multiplication. Most people file before they've ever done that multiplication. Here's the strange part. Almost everyone making this decision believes they've already done the math. They've seen a break-even chart somewhere, usually pinned to age 80, and it feels like enough to decide on. It isn't. The break-even age most people carry around in their heads is built on an assumption so basic that almost nobody questions it, and so wrong that it quietly reroutes a decision worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Before satellites, ships found their position through dead reckoning. Take your last known point, your speed, your heading, the hours elapsed, and calculate where you have to be now. The formula is sound. It moved fleets across oceans for centuries. But it only works if every input fed into it is true. Get the speed wrong by half a knot. Let a current push the hull sideways without accounting for it, and the formula keeps calculating with total confidence, while the ship drifts further from where the math insists it is, mile after mile, until the gap between the chart and the coastline becomes the whole story. The standard Social Security break-even calculation is dead reckoning with a corrupted input. The formula, cumulative early payments, weighed against the monthly advantage of waiting, is arithmetically correct. What's wrong is the assumption baked silently into it that the money collected early sits somewhere earning exactly nothing for years, patiently waiting to be compared against the larger check. Nobody's money earns zero. Correct that single input, and the age on the calculator stops being 80. It starts moving, 84, 86, 90. And for a meaningful share of the people who ever run this number, it stops arriving at all. That's the actual subject of this video, not whether 62 or 70 is right, but how the accepted math got its most important input wrong, in the same direction, for millions of people, and what happens once you feed it the correct one. Your SSA.gov account shows 3 numbers the moment you log in: the reduced benefit at 62, the full benefit at your full retirement age, and the maximum benefit at 70. Most people spend 30 seconds on the wrong one, because most people still believe full retirement age is 65. It hasn't been 65 for anyone in decades. For everyone born in 1960 or later, meaning essentially anyone making this decision today, full retirement age is 67. That 2-year gap between the number in most people's heads and the number the SSA actually uses isn't trivial. On its own, it's enough to make someone miscalculate their own reduction penalty by up to 10 percentage points before they've opened a single calculator. The error doesn't start with the break-even math. It starts one screen earlier, with a birth year and an outdated assumption about what full even means. Here's what that reduction actually looks like once it stops being a percentage and becomes a phone call. Full retirement age benefit, $2,500 a month. Dial 1-800-772-1213, tell the representative you want to file at 62 instead of 67, and they'll confirm the number without hesitation, a 30% permanent reduction. They're required to tell you that. What they're not required to walk you through in that same 15-minute call is everything sitting downstream of it: the compounding math, the tax thresholds, the survivor implications 2 decades away. You hang up having answered one question completely and started 6 others you didn't know to ask. The direct deposit that hits the account isn't $2,500, it's $1,750. $750 a month. Gone. Every month. For as long as the account exists. $9,000 a year. Over 20 years, $180,000. And that number doesn't even flatter the early filer, because Social Security's annual cost of living adjustment applies to whatever number got locked in on that phone call. A smaller starting benefit gets a smaller raise, forever. The gap doesn't close with inflation. It grows by the same percentage on both sides, which means, in dollar terms, it only ever widens. But claiming at 62 buys something real, and it's worth naming honestly before the case against it builds any further. Time. 96 monthly checks land in the account before someone who waited to 70 has received their first payment at $1,750 a month. That's $168,000 collected, not projected, already banked, before the delayed strategy has paid out a single dollar. 8 years is long enough that $168,000 doesn't feel like an abstraction. It feels like proof, sitting in a real account on a real statement, while the alternative strategy has produced exactly nothing to look at yet. Most break-even calculations stop their analysis right here at this exact figure, treating $168,000 as a simple head start to be caught up to later. That's precisely where the math starts to go wrong. The textbook version of that catch-up math looks clean. Divide the $168,000 head start by the $750 monthly advantage of waiting, and you land on 224 months, age 80 and 7 months. It's the number that shows up in almost every article, every calculator, every well-meaning piece of advice about this decision. The SSA's own website even hosts a break-even tool that runs the identical comparison, payments measured dollar for dollar, with no field anywhere on the page asking what the early money might have earned while it waited. The tool isn't lying. It's just never been asked the one question that actually moves the answer. And that's the assumption nobody says out loud, that the $168,000 sits untouched, earning exactly 0% for 8 straight years, waiting patiently to be compared against the larger check. Nobody's money behaves that way. It's the corrupted input in the dead reckoning formula, arithmetically tidy and quietly wrong from the moment it's entered. Correct that single number, and the age 80 break-even doesn't just shift, it starts to come apart. That's where this is headed, how far the real crossover point actually moves once real returns get involved, and why almost nobody runs that version of the math before they file. If you want to see exactly how many years that one bad assumption is worth, subscribe, because we're about to run this calculation 3 different ways, and the real answer is nowhere near age 80. Here's the mechanism working underneath that early $168,000, the part the simple math never touches. $1,800 a month from Social Security is $21,000 a year that never has to come out of a retirement portfolio. On a $500,000 account, that's the difference between a 4.2% annual withdrawal rate and one that sits right at the edge of the most widely cited sustainability line in retirement planning, the 4% rule. Claim early, and Social Security isn't just income. It's a lever that keeps the portfolio's own withdrawal rate under the number research treats as the boundary of probably fine, without touching a dollar of principal to do it. That's not a marginal cushion. It's the difference between a portfolio that's merely surviving retirement and one that's still positioned to keep growing through it. The Social Security Administration didn't pick 62, 67, and 70 arbitrarily. Benefits are designed to be actuarially neutral at roughly age 82 to 83. Meaning for the average person, claiming early or claiming late is engineered to come out roughly equal by that age. But average is a population number built from everyone who ever files, healthy and chronically ill alike, blended into one curve. If the men in your family have consistently died in their mid-70s, that actuarially neutral crossover point was never designed for your specific case. It was calibrated for a population. You are not a population. You're one data point trying to decide whether to trust a number built from millions of other ones. Nobody hands you your own personal actuarial table before you file. You're handed the populations and expected to treat it as if it already knows something specific about you. Now put the two effects together, the $168,000 collected early and the $21,000 a year the portfolio never had to release. Money that stays invested instead of being withdrawn keeps compounding on a $500,000 portfolio earning 7%. By year 8, the growth on that preserved capital adds somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000 on top of the original $168,000 head start. The real early claiming advantage was never just the checks that arrived first. It's those checks plus every dollar of growth the untouched principal was allowed to keep generating while it sat there, uninterrupted. This is the realization that tends to arrive quietly, years later, usually around 74, the moment someone who claimed early looks at the $9,000 a year gap they thought they were tracking, and discovers it was never a static number. 8 years of compounding on preserved capital had already absorbed a meaningful share of it, long before anyone actually sat down to run the comparison. The gap they'd been picturing, and the gap sitting on the real statement had quietly stopped being the same number. Here's what the alternative looks like when the timing turns against it. Without Social Security income at 62, retirement expenses get funded by selling investments directly, and if the market drops 30% in year 2, the way it did between 2008 and 2009, those sales are coming out of an account that's already shrunk. A $500,000 portfolio falling to $350,000, with $21,000 a year still being pulled out of it, means liquidating at roughly 6% of a depleted balance instead of 4.2% of the original one. That gap doesn't stay contained to the 2 bad years. It follows the portfolio into every year of recovery that comes after, because there's no do-over on those withdrawals. Whatever left the account during the drawdown left permanently, taking its future growth with it. So run the actual number instead of assuming 0. At just 2% real growth on that $168,000 head start, a return so modest it barely beats inflation. The break-even doesn't sit at 80.7 anymore. It moves to somewhere around 84 to 85. That's the crossover shifting 3 to 4 full years, using a return assumption most advisors would consider conservative to the point of pessimistic. Roughly what a savings account or a short-term bond ladder has produced in plenty of ordinary years. The bar for beating the textbook break-even age turns out to be lower than almost anyone assumes. The age 80 number was never really 80. It was 80 assuming an asset class that doesn't exist. Push the assumption closer to something a diversified portfolio might actually produce. 5% average returns, still below the long-run historical average for stocks. And the break-even moves again, this time to roughly 86 or 87. 6 years total, added to the crossover simply by replacing a fictional 0% with a number well inside the range of ordinary, unremarkable investing. A plain 60-40 portfolio has averaged well above 5% over most rolling 20-year periods in market history. This isn't an aggressive assumption being smuggled in, it's closer to a conservative one. The number everyone quotes was never really about Social Security. It was about a return assumption nobody bothered to check. At 7%, the long-run historical average for a balanced portfolio, not an aggressive one. Something different happens entirely. Claim at 62, reinvest the difference, and the cumulative total a delayed claimer would need to catch up to doesn't get surpassed before age 95. Average life expectancy sits at 82.5 for men and 85 for women. At realistic historical returns, the crossover simply never arrives inside an average lifetime. Purely as an individual wealth calculation, before survivor benefits enter the picture at all, waiting until 70 is, at a return this portfolio has actually delivered before, the mathematically losing strategy for most people. This is the dead reckoning formula never accounted for, a real rate of return pushing the plotted position further from reality with every year that passes. The chart said 80. Reality is somewhere past 88. The formula didn't break. The input was never seaworthy. Flip the scenario entirely, and the danger runs the other way. $45,000 a year in expenses, pulled from a $500,000 portfolio with no Social Security income at all, is a 9% annual withdrawal rate. The original Trinity study and the research that followed it found that portfolios drawn at 9% failed within 20 years in the majority of scenarios tested against historical market data. The reason the 4% rule became the industry's reference point isn't caution for its own sake. It's that every percentage point above it measurably drags down the odds of the money lasting 30 years. There's no version of that finding that gets kinder with a strong market year or two. 9% is simply a rate most 30-year retirements were never built to survive. Scale the portfolio up, and this entire decision changes shape. $21,000 a year in Social Security income against a $1 million portfolio is only a 2.1% withdrawal rate eliminated, a rounding error, functionally, next to a portfolio that can likely sustain retirement without Social Security income at all. At this size, Social Security stops being a bridge and starts being closer to optional, which means the case for it shifts too. Less about protecting the portfolio and more about maximizing the pure longevity insurance a larger inflation-adjusted check at 70 provides. The decision doesn't disappear at this size. It stops being a survival question and becomes an optimization one, which is a very different conversation to walk into. Here's what that withdrawal rate difference does to the actual odds of success, not just the percentage on paper. Dropping the withdrawal rate from 9% to 5.6%. the exact shift $21,000 a year in Social Security income produces raises the 30-year portfolio survival probability from roughly 55% to 82%, based on historical Monte Carlo simulation using market data back to 1926. That's not a marginal improvement sitting in a footnote somewhere. It's close to the entire distance between a plan that's more likely to fail than not and one that's more likely to succeed than not. Put another way, at 55%, the plan is closer to a coin flip than most people filing this paperwork would ever be comfortable admitting out loud. Here's that gap outside of a simulation. Someone leaving work in 2007 with $500,000 and no Social Security income, withdrawing $30,000 a year. By the end of 2009, that portfolio had fallen to roughly $280,000, while the withdrawals kept coming from an account that had already lost more than a third of its value. The same retiree with $21,000 a year in Social Security income only needed to pull $9,000 from the portfolio during those same 2 years. Same crash, same calendar, same starting balance. And by the time the recovery finally arrived, one portfolio had far less ground left to make up than the other. An entirely different sequence of return story heading into the years that followed. None of this works automatically though, and this is the part that quietly breaks the strategy for people who think they've already built it. The bridge only functions if the withdrawals from the portfolio actually stop once Social Security starts. Claim at 62 and keep pulling from the portfolio at the same rate anyway, and Social Security hasn't built a bridge. It's just added income on top of the same depletion that was already happening. The strategy isn't a filing date. It's a filing date paired with a behavioral change that has to actually happen every month for it to mean anything at all. In practice, that means the withdrawal that used to fund a grocery bill or a mortgage payment has to actually be replaced by the Social Security deposit, dollar for dollar, in the same month, not layered on top of spending that never adjusted. It's a simple rule. It's also the single most common way the entire strategy quietly fails without anyone noticing for years. There's also a question the break-even math never asks, whether a dollar at 63 and a dollar at 74 are worth the same thing to the person spending it. Research on retirement spending patterns shows the heaviest discretionary years, travel, activity, anything that requires energy and mobility, cluster between ages 62 and 75. Spending typically moderates from 75 to 85, then shifts almost entirely toward healthcare after 85. The extra $1,620 a month gained by waiting arrives, on average, during the years spending is already declining, not during the years it was doing the most work. It's a strange kind of trade, paying a premium in the form of 8 delayed years for dollars that arrive precisely when there's less life left to spend them on. And every one of these break-even ages is still built on an average, which means, by definition, it's wrong for half the people using it. SSA data puts remaining life expectancy at 62 at 20.4 years for men, to roughly 82.5, and 23.1 years for women, to roughly 85. 50% of people outlive their own average. For married couples, the odds that at least one spouse lives past 90 sit close to 48%. Planning around the average life expectancy isn't a neutral choice. It's planning to run out of runway for roughly half the population doing the exact same math. Nobody knows in advance which half of that split they'll land in, which is exactly why this is as much an insurance question as it is a math one. Here's the one argument in favor of waiting that the break-even math was never built to capture. Social Security at 70 pays $3,720 a month, $44,640 a year, inflation adjusted, backed by the federal government for as long as you live. Replicating that same guarantee with a private inflation-adjusted annuity at current pricing would cost somewhere between $800,000 and $950,000 to purchase outright in a lump sum on the open market. This isn't a benefit available for sale at any price. It's earned, specifically by deferring, which makes it less a math problem and more the single largest guaranteed income purchase most people will ever make, paid for entirely in patience instead of dollars. No spreadsheet comparing two claiming ages has a line item for guaranteed, inflation-proof, government-backed income you cannot outlive, because there's no market price a retiree could simply write a check for at 62. The only purchase price is patience, paid in monthly installments of a smaller check for 8 years. There's a second person this decision is actually being made for, and it's rarely named out loud in the room where the filing happens. When the higher earner dies, the surviving spouse doesn't keep their own benefit. They receive whichever of the two checks was larger. Higher earner claimed at 62. The survivor inherits $2,100 a month for life. Higher earner waited to 70. The survivor inherits $3,720 a month for life. That's $19,440 a year, every year, potentially across 15 to 20 years of widowhood. The claiming decision made at 62 isn't just about the person making it. It's underwriting an insurance policy for whoever outlives them. A decision made once by one spouse that quietly sets the other spouse's income floor for however many years they end up living alone. This is also why, in a two-income household, the strongest version of this strategy usually splits the decision instead of applying it to both benefits at once. One benefit, $1,200 a month, at full retirement age, files at 62 for $840 a month, enough to partially bridge the household's income gap on its own. The second, larger benefit, defers all the way to 70. The household gets $840 a month in bridge income immediately. The portfolio behind the delayed benefit stays untouched, and the survivor benefit, the one that matters most, in dollar terms, for decades, gets maximized when the second filing finally happens. Two benefits, two different filing ages, one household running both strategies at once instead of choosing between them. It's not a compromise between two options. It's both of them, running simultaneously, on two separate benefits, inside a single household. Even the check that does arrive isn't fully spendable, and this is the calculation almost nobody runs before filing. Up to 85% of Social Security benefits become taxable once combined income, adjusted gross income, plus non-taxable interest, plus half of the Social Security benefit itself, crosses $44,000 for a married couple filing jointly. A household collecting $3,720 a month in Social Security plus $2,000 a month from an IRA lands around $65,840 in combined income, enough to make 85% of that Social Security, $37,944 of it, taxable. At the 22% bracket, that's $8,347 a year in federal tax attributable directly to the Social Security check. Structuring withdrawals from a Roth account instead, earlier in retirement, can pull that number down substantially, but only for someone who saw it coming before the filing, not after. Almost nobody runs this calculation beforehand, because almost nobody is thinking about marginal tax brackets in the same conversation as a claiming age. They feel like two different departments of the same decision. Somewhere in the middle of the delayed claiming years, a different envelope shows up. The Medicare enrollment letter, timed to turn 65 regardless of when Social Security itself gets filed. It looks routine. It isn't unrelated to any of this, because 2 years after whatever income shows up on a tax return, Medicare is watching. 2024's ARMA thresholds trigger Medicare surcharges once income crosses $103,000 for a single filer or $206,000 for a married couple, based on income from 2 years earlier, not the current one. Someone delaying Social Security who draws $120,000 from a traditional IRA in 2024 to cover living expenses triggers an ARMA surcharge that shows up in the mailbox in 2026, seemingly out of nowhere. At Tier 2, that's an extra $384.30 a month for Medicare Part B alone, $4,611 a year, and combined with the matching Part D surcharge, the total hidden Medicare cost lands somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 a year. It's a cost triggered directly by the delay strategy itself, and it's a number most delay advocates never once mention. Here's an argument for waiting that sounds compelling and isn't. Cost of living adjustments. The 2024 COLA was 3.2%, applied to a $2,100 check. That's a $67.20 monthly increase. Applied to a $3,720 check, that's $118.40. The dollar gap between the two benefits does widen every year COLA gets applied, but the ratio between them never moves, because the identical percentage is being applied to both sides at once. Run a $2,500 FRA benefit through 3.2% COLA for 20 years, and the calculator produces a number that feels like a win, right up until you run that same COLA against the $1,750 locked in at $62,000 and watch the gap stay proportionally exactly where it started. COLA isn't a case for waiting. It's mathematically neutral to the decision. It just makes the existing gap look more dramatic in raw dollars without changing anything underneath it. There's a risk running underneath every number in this video that neither claiming age fully escapes. The 2024 Social Security Trustees Report projects the combined trust funds depleting in 2033. At depletion, incoming payroll taxes are projected to cover roughly 79% of scheduled benefits. Not zero, not bankruptcy, but a mandated 21% across-the-board cut if Congress takes no action before then. Apply that to a $3,720 check, and it becomes $2,939, a number that, for some early claimers, sits below what they locked in permanently 11 years earlier. The trust fund date doesn't erase the advantage of waiting. It's simply a variable neither side of this decision gets to ignore. It's worth saying plainly, this isn't a prediction that benefits vanish. It's a documented, published projection that the current math doesn't fully add up past 2033 without a legislative fix. Run that 21% cut against both filing strategies side by side, and the shape of the answer holds, even as the size of it shrinks. The $2,100 check filed at 62 becomes $1,659. The $3,720 check filed at 70 becomes $2,939. The relative advantage of having waited survives the cut intact, but the break-even shifts even further out, because the delayed claimer collected exactly zero during the years the cut was being phased in, while the early claimers' smaller checks kept arriving the entire time. Price in even a 30% probability of that cut actually happening, and the risk-adjusted expected value of waiting comes down measurably from the number the simple math produces. The honest version of this video prices in some real chance that every number in it eventually gets multiplied by 0.79, and the ranking of the two strategies still doesn't change. So here's the calculation done correctly. The one almost nobody runs before they file. Take the cumulative Social Security received from 62 until death at the early claiming amount. Add investment returns on those payments at a realistic expected portfolio return, not zero. Take the cumulative Social Security received from 70 until death at the delayed amount. Find the age where that second number finally overtakes the first. For someone earning 7% and starting from a $2,100 monthly benefit at 62, that crossover doesn't show up at 80. It shows up somewhere around age 88 to 90, a full decade later than the number on the calculator most people use to make this decision. Correct the input, and dead reckoning becomes accurate again. The formula was never the problem. It only ever needed a real number where the zero used to be. Lay the scenarios side by side, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. At 0% returns, the crossover sits at roughly 80, the textbook answer. At 4%, it moves to 84 or 85. At 7%, it moves to 88 or 90. At 9%, it may not arrive before age 95 at all. The age 80 break-even, repeated in nearly every piece of retirement content, only holds if the money collected early earns absolutely nothing for the rest of a person's life. Every real percentage point of return pushes that crossover further away from the decision most people are actually making it around. But the bridge strategy has its own failure mode, and it shows up at the other end of the portfolio size spectrum. It requires two things: a portfolio large enough to survive the gap years without an unreasonable withdrawal rate, and the discipline to actually stop drawing from it once Social Security starts. A $200,000 portfolio against $40,000 a year in expenses, with Social Security claimed at 62 supplying $21,000 of that, still leaves $19,000 a year coming out of the portfolio, a 9.5% withdrawal rate on its own, below roughly $300,000. Paired with high expenses, claiming early doesn't protect the portfolio. It just slightly slows down a depletion that was already underway, which is exactly why the same benefit can produce two completely opposite correct answers, depending entirely on what's feeding the formula. Profile A on the ledger, $3,000 FRA benefit, $1,500,000 portfolio, married, age 62, healthy, spouse age 58. Run the numbers. And the correct answer is wait to 70. The portfolio comfortably sustains the bridge without Social Security income at all. The survivor benefit adds $19,440 a year for a spouse likely to outlive them by decades, and the longevity insurance value outweighs 8 years of smaller checks. Profile B on the ledger. The identical $3,000 FRA benefit, $350,000 portfolio, single, age 62, a family history of shorter longevity. Run the same formula, and the correct answer flips entirely, claim at 62. Portfolio preservation is critical at this size. The 7% return crossover doesn't arrive until age 88 to 90, well past a probable life expectancy given the family history, and there's no survivor benefit at stake to weigh against it. Same benefit, same formula. Two completely different correct answers, because Dead Reckoning was never wrong about the math. It was only ever as reliable as what got fed into it. Your speed, your heading, your return assumption, your health history, your household. Those are the real inputs, and no two people are entering the exact same ones. Check your own SSA.gov account. Look at all three numbers, not just the one in the middle. Because the right answer to 62 versus 70 was never a single age everyone shares. It was always just correct math waiting on the right inputs yours.